Thank you for your patience. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're going to be starting shortly. We're just trying to get everybody in from the waiting room, and then we will start. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Denise Savagel, and I am the chair of the State Water Plan Education and Outreach subgroup. Welcome to our workshop on preparing for drought in Connecticut. I'm just going to do some administrative things, and then we're going to get right into our program. We're going to ask everyone to please shut off your video and mute yourself. If everyone could do that, it would be very helpful. We're only going to have the speakers available. And if you have questions for the speakers, we're going to actually use the chat. We're going to ask you not to use the chat for any discussions or chat, but actually just for the questions. So if you have a question for one of the speakers that comes up, please put it in the chat. We're just finishing up, getting everybody in from the waiting room. And I'm going to invite our first speaker, Martin Heft, to join me. Hi, Martin.
Good afternoon, Denise.
So Martin is the Undersecretary for Intergovernmental Policy and Planning Division with the Office of Policy and Management. Undersecretary Heft has 36 years of municipal and state government experience. At OPM, he currently oversees the Intergovernmental Policy and Planning Division that formulates and implements state policy pertaining to the relationship between the state of Connecticut, Regional Council of Governments, and municipalities. As part of this position, he is a member of the Water Planning Council and chairs the Interagency Drought Work Group. Before Martin joined OPM, he was a senior advisor to Nancy Wyman in her elected positions of Lieutenant Governor and Comptroller. Martin's municipal experience spans 20 years in the town of Chester, holding several leadership roles, including first selectman, town treasurer, and assistant town treasurer. Thank you for joining us, Martin. And we know we're in good hands with you overseeing our interagency work group.
Thank you very much, Denise, and appreciate the opportunity to address everyone here today. And let me first just start off by thanking the State Water Plan Outreach and Education Subgroup, and Denise, you as chair, for pulling all this together and all the hard work that you have been doing with this. So I did want to just get that thank you out to you and your group. If we could do the next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So the Water Planning Council, and I'm going to give you a little update, and then I'll go through the interagency drought work group so you have an understanding and kind of set where we're going to be going for the rest of the workshop here today. So in 2001, Public Act 01-177 established the Water Planning Council, referred to as WPC, to basically address issues involving water companies, water resources, and state policies regarding the future of the state's drinking water supply. The WPC is comprised of 4 members representing the Department of Public Health, the Office of Policy and Management, Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. Next slide. Thank you. So the State Water Plan was adopted June 5th, 2019, and that's all pursuant to Connecticut state statutes. Following the adoption of the State Water Plan, the council's focus has been on the implementation of the plan and the recommendations contained therein. The Water Planning Council, with support of the advisory group, established an implementation work group to develop priorities and make further recommendations, obviously making sure these 2 groups work very well with the council to make sure that the areas of the plan are adopted. One of the top priorities in the plan was drought management. Or the next slide. So with that, the Water Planning Council did establish the Interagency Drought Work Group, or IDW, as the entity responsible for actively monitoring water conditions and recommending drought declarations and mitigation actions to the Office of the Governor and state agency commissioners. Under the authority of the WPC, in accordance with the official Connecticut Drought Preparedness and Response Plan. The Interagency Drought Work Group consists of representatives from Connecticut Department of Agriculture, the Office of Policy and Management, Department of Public Health, Department of Emergency Services and Public Protection, Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. Next slide. Through the Water Planning Council's website, you can pull up the full drought preparedness and response plan, which was adopted and recently just a few changes to it. Most recently revision September 6th of 2022. So I encourage everyone as a reference can go back and look up this response plan as well as the state water plan. Next. So the plan objectives, and there are 7 of them, is 1, describe what preparations should be in place prior to a drought declaration. 2, define criteria and guidelines to assess the severity of drought conditions or drought stage in a given area. 3, identify state, regional, local, federal, and private sector entities that are responsible for undertaking drought management actions. 4, provide a guide for entities to undertake drought management actions for which they are responsible in the areas of coordination, public outreach, assessment, and preparedness. 5, define communication strategies to integrate activities of the responsible parties. 6, identify a progression of water use restrictions that may be implemented at the state or local level. And 7, promote effective mobilization of public and private resources to manage drought mitigation efforts. And Next slide. And as I mentioned in objective number 2 about defining criteria and guidelines to assess the severity of drought conditions or drought stages on a given area, we have 5 drought plan stages here. Stage 1 being very early signs, stage 2 an emerging drought, stage 3 when a drought's well established, 4 when it's a widespread severe impacts to public and private water supplies, and then a stage 5, which where water supplies are depleted to a point threatening public health. So the interagency drought work group reviews all the different criteria. You're going to hear more about that later from some of our wonderful panelists you have here today. And with that, I'm going to, am I turning it back to you, Denise? Or am I turning it to Doug?
Okay, I'm gonna have Doug.
Okay,
Yes.
so Doug.
Thank you, Martin. Hi, my name's Doug Hoskins, and I'm the moderator for the panel this afternoon. Thanks to Denise and for getting this all together and having this discussion on drought in Connecticut. And it's very timely, as people who might be following the weather might have noticed. It's drying out just a little bit, and we had a bit of a discussion on that in our interagency drought work group previously. So keep your eye to the weather report on that. And I'm just going to introduce some of the panelists, or all our panelists, this afternoon. And first, myself, I've worked with the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection since 1993. And I'm currently the lead for the Consumptive Water Diversion Program, where we regulate large withdrawals of ground and surface waters. I also serve as a member of the Connecticut Interagency Drought Work Group that Martin spoke of just now. I previously led DEEP's Municipal Inland Wetland Technical Assistance Program, and I began my career as a natural resource planner at the Harford County Soil and Water Conservation District, which is now known as the North Central Soil and Water Conservation District. Eric Lindquist will be next up as our panelist presentation. And Eric has been involved with Connecticut's water planning efforts since 2014. He recently joined the state's Department of Public Health in November 2022, where he is undertaking planning efforts to ensure safe and adequate drinking water supplies. In his previous capacity at the State Office of Policy and Management, he led efforts to revise our Drought Preparedness and Response Plan and coordinated implementation of the plan during the droughts in 2016, which spanned into 2017, and then in 2020 and 2022. He has prior experience in fisheries management and has worked in dozens of water bodies across the state, leading him to develop a firsthand appreciation of the need to protect watersheds and balance the competing demands of limited water resources. Following Eric will be Deanne McCarthy. Deanne has been with the U.S. Geologic Survey in the New England Water Science Center since 2015. She is involved with everything from stream flow and groundwater data collection in the field to data analysis and science report publications. Deanne coordinates and oversees the groundwater monitoring network in Connecticut and has recently expanded that role New England-wide. Deanne's recent work is focused on drought as the lead author of the 2022 drought in New England and co-author of the 2020 drought in New England USGS publications. And David Knopf will be bringing it all home for us this afternoon. And he has served the town of Darien as Director of Health since 2008. David began his career in public health, working for the environmental health section of the State Department of Public Health, then transitioned to the newly formed Farmington Valley Health District and helped guide its successful growth. from a 3-town district serving a population of 25,000 to a 10-town district serving over 100,000. His experience has provided him with a unique opportunity to serve as a public health official on the state level, as well as for a single municipality and a multi-town health district. He is past president of both the Connecticut Environmental Health Association and Connecticut Association of Directors of Health. And I will now turn it over to Eric.
All right, thank you, Doug. Good afternoon. Thanks, Denise. I want to echo Martin's thanks for putting this together. Thanks to members of the Outreach and Education Subgroup for inviting us to be panelists at today's talk. I'm really impressed with the turnout today. Looks like there's just shy of 90 attendees tuned in now. And so for people to be, prioritizing spending their lunch hour on a beautiful 75-degree day, tells me that this is a topic that people really care about and they're really passionate about. And perhaps this means we need to do more of this, have more of these conversations and presentations on this in the future. So this is great. I'm told I only have 10 minutes to talk today, so I apologize. I'm gonna fly through my slides, and I apologize for having to move quickly, but let's dive right in and we'll cover as much as we can. Okay, so again, I don't have time to cover every aspect of the drought plan, but I did want to pick a few areas that may be of interest to the audience today. We'll start by looking again at the agencies on the Interagency Drought Work Group that Martin mentioned, looking at what they do, very high level, and then a very brief run through of the primary drought indicators that the Interagency Drought Work Group considers when implementing the drought plan. And I apologize, I just realized my screen is not sharing properly, so let me try to fix that. Okay, can folks see my slides now?
Yes, there.
Okay, so let me just try to, here, all right. Back to the title slide. Apologies, this was the title slide, not that it matters now. But then once again, here we go again. Sorry about the interruption. Talking points for today. We'll just briefly run through as much of this as we can in the time that we have. Okay, so again, as Martin mentioned in his introduction, here are the state agencies that serve as the voting members on the Interagency Drought Work Group, and who are chiefly responsible for implementing the state drought plan. Sorry about that. Many of you recall that I used to work with Martin at OPM, and so I'm familiar with OPM as the lead agency overseeing implementation of the state drought plan, handling communications with the governor's office, as well as public and media relations. The Department of Agriculture focuses on agricultural impacts and interests. The Department of Energy and Environmental Protection's primary concern is with protecting water resources, wildfire control, fisheries management, and related regulatory authorities. The Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, or PURA, has regulatory oversight of public utilities that sell water. Connecticut's Emergency Management Agency handles communication with municipal officials, coordinates state and federal disaster aid, provides weather forecasting services, and during more severe droughts, administers overall emergency response under the state response framework. And then there is my agency that I work in now, the Department of Public Health. I'm very excited to be here, taking on a new mission. One of the questions that often comes up is, why is the health department, or local health departments for that matter, involved in drought? Doesn't DPH focus on things like food contamination and diseases? Well, the short answer is that access to clean, pure water is foundational to everyone's health. DPH has an important mission to ensure that everyone who is served by a public water source has access to safe, adequate water. There isn't one of us that can live without water. We all need it, not just for drinking, but bathing, cooking, growing food. It's so important to every aspect of daily life It's easy to take for granted. We just turn on the faucet and expect it to pour out, and we expect it to be safe and pure. That's where DPH's mission comes into play. That's where my passion now lies, to oversee those public water supplies and resources and ensure that water suppliers are taking those necessary steps during a drought to ensure a reliable supply, to plan for uncertainties, planning for the risks posed by a changing climate, working with local, state, and federal partners to ensure that faucets don't run dry during drought years. And that's why I remain passionate about drought planning and why I'm talking here today. Moving on to drought indicators, there are 9 primary indicators that the drought plan lists as the criteria for the interagency drought work group to evaluate dry conditions. For a given drought stage, the plan lists thresholds that each of these indicators would roughly be expected to correspond to. An example of the thresholds for stage 2 is in the box on the right. Let's run through these very briefly. One side note for everyone, the graphics that are coming up on the forthcoming slides are just for visual representation, and they don't necessarily correspond to current conditions. I just want to be clear on that. So starting off with precipitation, one of our federal partners, the National Weather Service, provides monthly analysis of precipitation that fell across the state. And the monthly totals are then compiled to produce a running percent of normal that can be calculated for any given number of months. In preparing these data, the National Weather Service uses official rain gauges at climate monitoring sites across the state, combined with data from a group of volunteer weather monitors that participate in the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network, or COCO-RAS. The gaps are then filled in using radar-based modeling from the Advanced Hydrologic Prediction Service. An example of that modeling is what's depicted in the colorful map on your screen. Another federal partner, the United States Geological Survey, who you're going to be hearing from shortly through Deanne, maintains a network of groundwater monitoring wells around the state. Some of the wells are known as real-time wells because they are equipped with instrumentation to constantly report water levels on set intervals. Other wells are manually measured by USGS staff generally once per month. Deanne will provide a lot more detail on this coming up. Groundwater, it's important to note, groundwater is a long-term drought indicator because it usually is the last thing to decline during a period of drought and also the last thing to recover. Like the groundwater monitoring network, USGS also maintains a streamflow monitoring network across the state. Streamflow responds much more quickly to oncoming drought than does groundwater, so it's useful for both short and long-term drought analysis. Again, I'm going to defer to Deanne in her coming talk to fill in the important details there. The Palmer Drought Index is a standardized index published by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that estimates relative dryness using available precipitation and temperature data. This index is better suited for quantifying long-term drought, and this measure sometimes presents conflicting data when evaluating shorter-term drought. One of its weaknesses is that it does not account for the delayed runoff from snow or ice melt. The Crop Moisture Index, or CMI, is exclusively an indicator for agricultural drought. It is a short-term indicator that can change rapidly by the week. Like the Palmer Drought Index, CMI is calculated for broad climate divisions and doesn't account for local variations in dryness due to non-uniform rainfall patterns, such as what we would see during summer thunderstorm activity. The input data for CMI calculations for a given climate division includes weekly precipitation totals, average temperature, average water capacity of the soil, and the previous history of the index. The Vegetation Drought Response Index, or VeggieDry, is a weekly depiction of vegetation stress. VeggieDry is unique because it incorporates satellite-derived information in the calculations. The satellite data include percent average seasonal greenness and start of season anomaly. Both of these variables are acquired by NOAA's AVHRR satellite network, which stands for Advanced Very High Resolution Radiometer, which takes satellite imagery of the Earth on a daily basis at 1 square kilometer. And those square kilometers are the pixels you're seeing on the map on the screen. The Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection's Forestry Division produces daily reports of forest fire conditions. These reports are considered by the Interagency Drought Work Group, but the data is extremely short-term as fire weather conditions vary by the day and by the season. For example, fire danger can be low if we are receiving just enough precipitation to keep fuel moisture levels up, even if we are in a serious long-term drought. Conversely, fire danger can be high during dry, windy periods shortly after a period of substantial rain, especially in the spring. Those of you who are familiar with fire weather know that the past week has been particularly high risk for wildfire outbreaks here in New England. The U.S. Drought Monitor is the one drought indicator that the general public might be the most familiar with, largely due to the preference of local TV meteorologists showcasing its colorful maps. It launched in 2000, and it's updated weekly each Thursday to show the location and intensity of drought across the country. The map is compiled with data collected and analyzed by regional meteorological and hydrological experts. Okay, I saved the best for last. No, I'm just kidding. This is where DPH's role comes into play. And I wanted to spend an extra minute here to really highlight DPH's role with reservoir reporting. We have a long history of tracking reservoir levels across the state dating back to at least the 1980s. So a fair number of reservoirs have a period of record that is several decades or more, which is great for drought tracking purposes. The reporting is done by the utilities. Back in the day, the reports would come in by hard copy that arrived via US mail, and staff at the health department would read and then transcribe the information into manual spreadsheets. Well, today we have electronic reporting. And this is where I need to make a big shout out to Steve Harkey, my colleague at DPH. Hopefully he's on listening today. Steve is the data guru who compiles all these data and prepares the reports and the visualizations, and he handles communications with all the utilities and keeps everything in check. This is a big task to wrangle up all these data for dozens of water supplies across the state, especially during a drought. So Steve deserves a lot of credit there. And Steve also hopes to someday develop an even more modernized reporting system that would automate a lot of the processes and display reservoir data in real time, like what some Western states have implemented. And there's also a private well piece to all this too. It's sometimes easy to forget the private well owners who really are on their own with no assistance or resources and can often face trouble during dry years. Ryan Tetro, who I think may be on the line today too, leads a private well program at DPH and does his best to guide private well owners on best practices and also track private well issues as they unfold. We have some work we'd like to do to improve our tracking in this realm also.
All right, Eric, I'm sorry, it's time to wrap it up.
Sorry, Doug, thank you for letting me know. So just real quick about the future, we have a moderate level of confidence that climate change will have an impact on drinking water supplies. The question being, do we have the planning in place to address some of the impacts we are seeing? What about impacts to water quality, not just quantity? Capacity of treatment plants to handle more serious things like harmful algal blooms. There's recommendations in the governor's GC3 climate report that focus on drinking water supplies. So there's always more things to look at, more to do, more tracking and monitoring. It continues to be evolutionary, and I'm excited to be part of that now at DPH. Unfortunately, I did need to keep this tighter, and I had so much more that I wanted to go through here, but I'm not going to be able to really spend, just really briefly, I'll put these up real quick, and then I'm going to wrap up. These are some other considerations that are not listed in the drought plan itself, but that the drought plan encourages the Interagency Drought Work Group to consider to get that really holistic ground level look at what's going on. I did want to spend a little time on this slide, but I just can't because I need to be respectful of other folks' time about implementation. Happy to address questions on it after the fact. I'm sure there'll be a recording. You can come back to this. And again, another slide on the importance of municipal drought liaisons and what their role is in all of this. Connecticut Drought Information Center is available online at portal.ct.gov/water. And you can find all of this information on that website along with the updated drought plan. Lastly, we're always welcoming feedback. We're in transitional period with a new state drought coordinator that's taken over in OPM, pending WPC approval, but her name is Rebecca Dahl, and she'll be delighted to hear from you if you have any feedback or questions or concerns. Again, thank you for your time. Pleasure to speak today, and sorry for running over, Doug. Thanks for getting after me.
All right, Eric, no problem. Sorry, there's a lot of information we've got to get in. And next up will be Deanne McCarthy, U.S. Geologic Survey.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk with you guys today. Eric, can you stop sharing your screen? I think they'll let me share mine. Thanks. All right. So let's get the screen shared. Does everybody see the presentation?
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay, let's check on that. Oh, I gotta hit share, that would help.
Yeah. You're good.
All right, awesome. So yeah, I'm really excited to be a panelist today, and a big thank you to Denise, Doug, and also Eric, who gave USGS a great intro in those drought indicators presentation there. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about USGS data and drought monitoring. Just a couple low flow photos there on the front screen from our recent drought conditions last summer at some of our stream gauges. And so just getting into, a brief overview, what is drought and how do we define it? It can be difficult to define it. Typically we think of a drier than normal period, but we can define drought by many different ways, including its spatial extent, intensity, its magnitude, how long does the drought last, and the systems it impacts. Here at the USGS, we're mostly concerned with the hydrologic drought, so the stream flow and groundwater conditions. And to the right is a screen capture from the US Drought Monitor Eric was just talking about from the recent drought at the end of August in 2022. And you can see conditions in the Northeast and the different stages that the US Drought Monitor shows. And so I wanted to go over just a bit of our stream gauge and our groundwater network, just a really quick overview with a limited time. But our stream gauge network, so we have about 70 real-time stream gauges, and that does include 3 in Mass and 1 along the New York line. So that map there you can see in the black triangles are all our stream gauges along with the major basins in the area there. And so, I just wanted to provide some resources of where can you find that information for our stream gauges and what might be useful for drought documentation. So to the left here is a screen grab from our Water Watch USGS page. So this can be useful for looking at conditions. And if you zoom in here, the menu, there's actually a spot for drought, and there's several different types of plots and information you can pull to help provide some insight on conditions in Connecticut. And so I just wanted to show a few examples of what you can pull there. So we have in the top, there's 7-day below normal stream flow, and you can have a couple different plots. You can look at something similar to what Eric was showing, and it'll highlight the stream gauges on the map that are below normal. And to the right at the top, this is actually a plot showing the percent of stream gauges that are below normal for the last 45 days. And I did pull these earlier this week, so you can see how we have quite a bit of stream gauges falling below normal as we hit April. You will notice it does say only 32 sites, and it's because Water Watch is looking at stream gauges with at least a 30-year period of record to have that long-term average. And you can also pull a drought table. So if you look below, you can choose a begin date and end date for a period, and you can pull information on sites that are at or near record lows. So that could be helpful. And then just a brief overview of our groundwater monitoring network in Connecticut. So we have 70 monitoring wells, and Eric discussed how we have some real-time ones with continuous data, and we have some that we just measure once at the end of the month. So 10 real-time sites and 60 periodically measured sites. And you can see those on the red circles on the map there, along with the geology of the area. And so a great tool to use to look at those conditions is this groundwater levels in New England website. This is made by our groundwater specialist in New England, John Mullaney, who has made it as a temporary replacement to what we used to have as Groundwater Watch, as USGS is nationally is trying to replace that product. And so you can actually see current groundwater levels when you go to the front page of that, along with information on how do they plot compared to their typical data for that site. And it is an interactive map. So if you wanted to get information on specific sites, you can click on them. And so here's an example for one of our real-time wells in Marlborough, Connecticut. And so the red is the data for this past year plotted over those percentile ranges, which is the data for that site for that month, kind of giving you a clue as to what might be normal, what might be below normal in those reds. The normal is in green, and above normal would be in the blue percentile ranges. And so just wanted to get into, so how does the USGS cooperate with the Connecticut Interagency Drought Work Group to help make these drought declaration decisions? So we provide technical assistance, and we help summarize our hydrologic conditions so that the voting members have information to make these decisions. So these are some of the criteria that Eric was just pointing out, but I highlighted the groundwater and stream flow information. So for stage 2 up in the top, you can see that for groundwater and stream flow conditions, we're looking at having at least 2 of 3 months below the 25th percentile for both groundwater and stream flow. In a stage 3 drought, we would have groundwater conditions would have 4 consecutive months below the 25th percentile, and stream flow would be 4 to 5 months below the 25th percentile. And so this is an example of what our groundwater specialist, John Mullaney, pulls together for the Connecticut Interagency Drought Work Group. So this is from July 2022. These are information on our stream gauges. So by county, so each county is a list of the total stream gauges, and then the number of stream gauges below normal at that time, and then the number of stream gauges that hit that criteria for stage 2 or stage 3 drought, as well as the percents for those. So percent below normal, percent stage 2, and percent stage 3. So just an example of that. And this is very similar, but an example for groundwater levels. And so the total number of wells in each county, the number of wells below normal, and the number of wells that hit those stage 2 and stage 3 criteria, as well as the percents. And so, yeah, I just wanted to keep it really brief and try to just go over, briefly our networks and where you can find some information on our hydrologic conditions, some contact information there for you, and some of the links as to some of those tools that I was going over. And just wanted to put a little bit of a shout out to a recent publication we put out entitled 2022 Drought in New England, and that summarizes the hydrologic conditions last summer. And so, yeah, with that, I'll give it back to Doug. Really excited to be able to present today. Sorry, just very quick overview, but thank you.
Right, Deanne, thank you. And hopefully we'll have some questions, I'm sure, coming up later in our webinar about your presentation. And we're right on track. Thanks for making the moderator happy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So our next and final presenter will be David Knopf of the town of Darien. David?
Yes, thank you very much, Doug. I'm honored to be here today, part of this discussion. So important. I mean, water, what is more important than that? And it's amazing to me that humanity, we're absolutely dependent on precipitation for our water. We don't create it. It's totally out of our control, but we can manage it. And obviously that's what this is supposed to be all about. This whole session in the state water plan. So policies can be created. The state water plan is there, but as with so many other aspects of government and regulations and expert guidance, the implementation and actions are taken on a local level. And this is another one of those situations where the activities of the towns are critical and municipalities are critical in managing our water supply. Next slide, please. I'm going to fly through this stuff because I want to get to the question and answer. We get a lot of rain in Connecticut compared to a lot of other parts of the country, over 50 inches of rain, and we've got a lot of water around us. But as we know, there are times when the rainfall isn't consistent. And when we go through patterns of a real lot of rain and then no rain. Next slide, please. And, we all know what a drought is and we all know what it looks like. And, but we never know when it's going to end. So, and a drought affects everything we do. Whether in the worst case scenario, it would be affecting public health. Next slide, please. There's a lot of barriers to drought preparedness in Connecticut. And one of them is, like I said, with our last drought that we had here in 2016, I heard many times during the discussion of whether we were going to adopt an emergency declaration here in town. The answer was, well, it'll rain. It always does, sooner or later. So there's that perception. Droughts come and go. So, there's that fundamental problem with getting the information across to people. And that's why the state water plan with the implementation guide and levels of drought is so critical, so that we can actually have some measure to work with in determining what we need to do in reacting to low water levels and lower amounts of precipitation. It's easy to see in that the groundwater presentation that Dan just did was really good because, we could all see problems with surface water supply, stream flow being low, lakes being low, reservoirs being low, but you can't tell with groundwater being low until people start running out of water in their private wells. And interestingly enough, in Connecticut, 23% of Connecticut residents are served by private wells. And since they're privately owned, not subject to oversight given the public water supplies, they really haven't been well addressed in water planning. And there is that issue of how do you address a private well that's owned and not as part of a municipal or a utility water supply? And how do you control a person who may be wanting to irrigate using their well water, which itself is a dubious activity, even when it's not in times of drought. But when there is drought and, people on public water supplies, you can manage that, but you can't necessarily manage what goes on with someone that has a private well. Next slide, please. So things that the towns can do to actually manage and prepare themselves for being able to respond to drought. We all have emergency preparedness plans, but I'm not so sure how many communities include drought as part of the emergency preparedness plan and integrate the emergency management director, chief elected officers, and other town agencies in coming together to form a team that would meet to discuss response to drought conditions. I think, somebody needs to be designated in the community to spearhead and track all the data that's being provided both by the state health department and USGS, and also interact with the water companies so that when these times of stress come up, that we're working in tandem and can come out with a coherent plan for residents. Recommend that there be a water supply ordinance to enable emergency declarations that may restrict water usage in certain circumstances. Planning is critical, and planning and having something for communities to fall back on and use as guides would be really important. Next slide, please. Individuals can do their part. We strongly encourage that for those who feel the importance to have green lawns and irrigate, that the irrigation systems use soil moisture sensors so that they're not going off when it's raining. I can't tell you how many times I've seen water running down the street because of misplaced sprinklers or sprinklers that are running when they shouldn't be because the ground is too wet. We need to reassess our green lawns anyway. Some thought there might be really well in hand. Obviously, we could more widely utilize water conservation and water recirculation, particularly in large places that, like golf courses, or, to reuse some of the water and use that for irrigation. But we use water for everything. It's a basis for our economy. It's a basis for our life. And we need to plan for, and I'm very pleased that we have this tool that we've developed and, that we're going to continue to refine. But I encourage all communities to plan and include drought preparation as part of the emergency preparedness plan for each community. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Doug. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David. All right, so that concludes our panelists' presentations. And we'll open up to chat questions that are coming in. Here is one from Mark Twist to everyone. And he says the infrastructure is very old and desperately in need of improvements, per US Senator Richard Blumenthal. The water leakage coming from any water company to a home or business is disconcerting. What is the state thoughts on this matter? And how will the state hold the water companies accountable for antiquated infrastructure? So by infrastructure, Mark, I assume you're talking about our drinking water distribution systems. So perhaps Eric from DPH would be able to follow up on this one. If not, can you open to everyone?
It's a great question. And it's a known problem that we're trying to work through here at the Department of Public Health. I am not prepared today to talk about all of the initiatives that DPH has in that area. I do see others from DPH on the line today, and I would like them to feel free to jump in. But it is something that, antiquated infrastructure is certainly something that we're dealing with now and going to continue to deal with and need to plan for in the future.
Yeah, Eric, thanks. And with my background at DPH, DEEP, sorry, Environmental Protection, I'll just quickly mention that our water diversion permits, which I'm heavily involved in, have leak detection conditions as part of any permit that we issue to these large water withdrawal entities, including water companies. And so as condition of permits, we have them look at their distribution systems on a regular basis and determine where those leaks are and how they're going to fix them. And we've had some good results with that so far, and we hope to in the future. Anybody else from DPH on infrastructure improvements?
Hi, Doug. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can, thanks.
Hi.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just, Eric gave a great answer, but there's so much embedded in that question. As you all may have heard about through Congress and Senator Blumenthal's work, and President Biden and the infrastructure, the bipartisan infrastructure law, which passed in November of 2021, has provided for additional funds to help our aging infrastructure for drinking water. It's known as the Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Fund. And there's tens of millions more money coming into help our public water systems that are eligible for that funding. And so we know it's not anywhere near enough to fix all of the aging infrastructure that exists, but certainly it is a huge historic investment that was made, which is an amazing investment in the provision of safe drinking water. Also, to follow along on what Doug mentioned, there are in Connecticut water supply plans that every utility that serves over 1,000 people are responsible to produce. Part of that plan is a water conservation plan, which they also, as utilities, are to look at their water that is lost and to work to address that, to get those percentages down to something that is more reasonable. Some utilities have lost water that are above 20%. Some are well below 15 or 12%. So it does vary from utility to utility. But through planning and through infrastructure investment, there's work that's being done. So there's so much more work to do, as always, because our infrastructure is aged across our state. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Lori. That's Lori Matthew, Department of Public Health, Chief of Drinking Water section, if not more. So I would like to invite all the panelists to turn on their video at this point. I see that they're still off, just to show your face and remain connected to the audience as we go through this question and answer. So the next question that we had was, is drought preparedness something municipalities will be required to address through their plan of conservation and development? And maybe David Knopf would be most expert to address this one on the local level, at least for Darien, and with his knowledge throughout the state.
I don't know about required, but it certainly makes a lot of sense to have one.
Okay, thank you. How does one find individual water company drought plans? For example, I cannot find MDC's drought plan on its website. And particularly, how does a customer know what, if anything, is expected of them at various drought stages? Thanks for a great webinar. Well, thank you, Fred. And Lori Matthew of the DPH was just mentioning that these drought plans can be found in their water supply plans. So maybe she would want to expound on that a bit.
And it's a really good question. The water supply plans, the emergency plans, they have drought plans embedded within them. Those are available through the water utility. Some of the information embedded within those plans have to be redacted, but most in the drought plan is not redacted, and it needs to be redacted. Those plans that I spoke of are plans that are provided to the Department of Public Health and through DEP, OPM, and PURA. So we all receive those plans, review them as part of our process, but certainly the utilities also have those plans, and you could request that plan directly of that particular water utility. And this one, Fred, you're asking about MDC in particular.
Anybody else? If not, there are no other questions. So maybe I can just fill in here. I know that David Knopf was talking about getting some designated people at the local level involved in drought response. And I know in our drought response plan, we have recently made some revisions to it to include what we call municipal drought liaisons. And those drought liaisons are designated at each and every town, we hope. And I believe we're just about there. Maybe Eric, don't want to put you on the spot, but as the plan expert, I think we're almost there with getting a municipal drought liaison in each municipality. Is that right?
That's right, Doug. I don't believe there are any towns remaining that have not designated one. Unfortunately, I ran out of time and I wanted to dive into that topic on the importance of having a municipal drought liaison and what that person's role is expected to be during a drought. Because one of the most important things is the dissemination and back and forth communication from high levels at state officials down to the local level, and for local officials to really understand what's going on in their community and then translate that information upward. And that's one of the most important functions that a municipal drought liaison would be expected to have.
And Eric, stay on there, because I think the next question is also, you're the man of the hour. How does Connecticut's planning compare to other surrounding states? Do all New England states have drought preparedness plans? And I know you were just on with Massachusetts to a meeting that they had, so at least you can speak to that and maybe some other New England states.
Yeah, most states across the country, I don't want to go on a limb and say all, because I have not researched all states, but most of them, including the New England states, have some capacity of a drought management plan. Some are more advanced than others. Some are funded, some are not funded. Some are more formalized, some are more ad hoc, but across the board, there is this understanding now, and I think it's really taking hold and getting a lot more traction as we're experiencing some of the impacts from climate change and some recent drought events. States are taking things a little more seriously and really working, with federal partners, stepping up our partnership with folks at the National Integrated Drought Information System and others to really understand what tools and technologies and data are out there and how we can bring those home to our home states and really make better use of those forecasting tools, those prediction tools, and most importantly, those management tool sets that we all need to get through a drought event. So yeah, I would say, Alicia, it's hard to compare, but Connecticut probably falls somewhere in the middle in terms of the robustness of our drought plan.
Right, and I see, thank you, Eric. That's great. I see a lot of other questions coming in, but we're nearing the end of our hour. And we'll make every effort to answer those offline. Denise, would you like to take final words?
Thank you, Doug, and thank you to all our panelists. And yes, we will look at those questions and make sure we get back to folks. I want to, like I said, again, thank all of our panelists for this informative workshop. This workshop was designed to give people a flavor of what we're doing in Connecticut, what's happening at the state level, how we're working with our state partners, and what needs to happen at the municipal level. So hopefully we gave you some food for thought. We are going to be following up on drought preparedness and climate in Connecticut with our next workshop, which is going to be slated for Tuesday, May 23rd. And we're really going to be looking at connecting forests and watersheds, the role of that forests have in protecting our public drinking water supply, but also protecting Long Island Sound and all of our waters. So hopefully you'll stay tuned for that, and we will see you next time. Thanks again, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. Goodbye.